Dear Father Ilya, blessed New Year. I'm glad you found time to join us. And we will start with the first question. How establishment of the Soviet Union affected the Russian Orthodox Church in diaspora? How Church itself dealt with such a blow? Because we all know that establishment of Soviet Union was some kind of discontinuity compared to the previous regime, the previous statehood. There are some intellectuals who try to make parallels between Tsarism and the Soviet Union, but I would disagree with that. So what's your point of view about that historical shift?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Blessed New Year. I hope that it's going to be good, healthy, and active to us all, and much more merciful than the previous year was. I'll start with the comment who tries to draw the parallels between Tsarist Russia and the communist rule. At times, people say that both systems have a rather autocratic way of dealing with the population overall, that there is no democracy and it was absolute autocracy. And perhaps as far as terms themselves goes, as far as words themselves goes, you definitely could draw this parallel. But the devil is in the details. And of course, when we're talking about the oppression under the Tsarist Russia, it is incomparable as far as human cost goes to what was going on under the communism. Tsarist Russia was not by any stretch of imagination a perfect regime, but it was not only in most but all of the ways better than what came to it after the revolution. It was by far less bloody. I'm thinking the most essential thing to take into consideration, which is completely ignored during any philosophical discussions, that in particular revolutionaries in Russia were deeply religious people. They did believe in communism, or maybe professed atheists, but they believed in the idea very religiously. And religion for them was the real entity of life. It was the way of life. And if you'd look at the manifesto of the revolutionaries that were created by the Russian emigres in Europe, even in the first part of the 19th century, around mid-19th century, you'd find that idea, not the human being, but an idea, took precedence. A question, this manifesto formulated as a set of questions and answers. And in one of the questions it says, if your comrade, if your friend, if your fellow party member falls into need and requires assistance, what should your action be? And the answer to that is that an individual need to evaluate what would benefit the party and the idea the most. It is not about the well-being of an individual, no matter how important to you that individual is. It's a pragmatical approach as to what would benefit the way to accomplish the ultimate goal. So we can say that it's completely dehumanizing idea. With those imperfections, Tsarist Russia never would have dreamed of having such an approach. Even with the basic institution of slavery for peasants up until 1860s, still there were reforms initiated, and after the civil upheaval, so-called First Russian Revolution of 1905 and until 1907, many positive changes have been implemented. Many would say too late and or too little, too late. But nevertheless, of course, there was not such rivers of blood where people could be arrested and tried and executed just because they belong to a particular social order under the previous regime. And it was not initiated under the Stalin. It was initiated as soon as Bolsheviks came to power, as soon as they took over. So for that reason, to compare two, of course, if you're sitting in a glorious auditorium or cabinet of a respected university and you're musing on the philosophical stance, you may see some similarities, and you always could see people who suffer, but just enormity of suffering of the population under the Soviets could not be compared to the worst years under the Tsarist Russia. Very often, comparison is drawn between the famine and plagues of the late 19th, early 20th century and late life in the USSR, which was pretty benign for most of the population. But you need to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. At the height of civil war and the height of great purges, perhaps daily body count under the Soviets was more or less as during the entire 300 rule of Romanov dynasty. There were people in the Tsarist Russia that were ostracized. There were people who were deprived of particular citizen privileges. We can talk about Jews, for instance, right? Who could not live everywhere in the territory of Russian Empire. And that was very sad, and not in a way of justification, but just making a note. Russian Empire was not the only country at that time where Jews didn't have the equal rights to the rest of the citizenship. Majority of them were confined to the areas where they lived for years, predominantly in the territory of the Polish state, part of which was annexed to Russia. There were not as many Jews even living before the end of 18th century. And of course, nothing is justifying, but things were improving very rapidly. And again, the reforms unfortunately came too late. They were not as drastic, they were not as complete, but time was needed. So there are many things that could not be justified. But of course, what came later was not an improvement by any stretch of imagination. The nations that populated, and we did talk about it last time, Soviet Union to a great degree lost their identity. New identity was not formed, it was creation of new men, but attempt to create new men was based on a new principle. It's a dehumanized biological form that would serve as an instrument of a system and instrument of an implementation of the system. Up to the horrid experiments, whether it's urban legend or not, but many say it's not, where 1920s Soviet scientists tried to interbreed a human and a monkey embryo, like a chimpanzee or gorilla, to create a universal soldier, this Frankenstein monster.
It sounds like a fairy tale to some.
Yes. So it, of course, we may dream of idealism, but it was unwinding of every social fabric of the society. Nowadays there are many different social concepts. Some of them are rather strange. Some of them are accepted. Some of them are not accepted. But we're not discussing it. We're talking about the society in the 1920s where damage was added to damage and there was no any kind of improvement. The situation was like, we'll try to build something new, and if it's not going to work well, then the hell with it. Lenin quoted saying that if a revolution would take 100 millions of lives, but if we need to triple the amount of casualties, it would worth it in an attempt to build a new society. So its society was in the particular ideology as he saw it, as he imagined it. But it's really creating martyrs. Blood was necessary There are a lot, somebody says, of heroes who fallen for revolution, others is, that's what we bring to those who disagree with us. But it was completely dehumanized. It's the greatest thing. It's complete dehumanization, complete dehumanization. So which was done supposedly for the good of the people, in reality was a deception. Peasants never get the access to the ground, you know, to the earth to work on. Within short, less than 15 years, there's going to be collectivization, you know, people would be forced back into the smaller same slavery as they were just recently liberated under the Tsars. Workers did not access to the fabrics, you know, there was not end of wars, you know, the creation of the Soviet Russia and then Soviet Union in 1922 gave birth to the endless military conflicts all around. It was a very aggressive state throughout its history. Provoked or not, necessary or not, is of course subject for discussion of professional historians, but there was no achieved peace. There was no achieved prosperity. You know, people were sacrificed to an idea. There was no freedom of expression. Intellectual life was frowned upon. Much was brought back under Stalin, say, so Christmas celebration, in form of celebration of New Year. The Christmas tree was outlawed as bourgeois thing. At the beginning, they tried to outlaw the very family, saying that family is bourgeois thing. It didn't sit well, so they had to go back. Soon after revolution, country fell into such disrepair, they needed to initiate a new economic policy, which basically reversed to capitalism. But when complete control over the state was established, then of course they get rid of those entrepreneurs that brought back the much necessary food and all the items and everything else, you know, household items and manufacturing and such. We're talking about rapid industrialization and say electrification of the country, which communists always pride themselves. But since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we know that all of those projects were initiated yet by the Tsarist government. You know, of course, it's a silly thing to say, but the number of railroads, you know, mileage-wise per year, as was built under the Tsar, was never matched even in late Soviet Union.
True, they had in that project, of course. And the Russian economy.
So even with all the military and it did not reach, which was a commonplace in Russia in 1913. They could not do the same things in 1989. It's not what's good and what's bad, but it's what about the priorities were.
Mm-hmm.
In order to build a mighty empire, you need to have a happy population. You need to have a prosperous population, you know. It's apparent to any teenager who would play a computer game. In order to win over your opponent, you need to have a good economy.
Oh.
I'm not saying in what level it was improved. We could talk about, say, the women rights, that of course a reduction of gender differences under the Soviets is admired by many. But again, the liberation movement and equality of rights became commonplace in short years in Europe and in United States and America and in most places around the world, without any kind of social destabilization. Mass education, again, program at least of secondary education was also initiated under the Tsarist government. So many of the programs the socialists implemented in a very militaristic way, they were envisioned before revolution, because it was an apparent need. But at what cost it was implemented? At what human cost? You know, where in 1930s country was turned as if into one big labor camp, where the most active, the most progressive, the most educated people were shunned upon, frowned upon, and if they escaped with their lives or were forced to immigrate, that was a salvation for them. Others were humiliated, executed, and in fact, World War II, which delivered in, you know, almost a death blow to historical Russia, in many ways was a saving period for many of the engineers, many scientists who were imprisoned in camps. The so-called father of Russian space rocketry, which was accelerated not without the Nazi or German trophies, but nevertheless, Sergei Korolev, he was imprisoned. In fact, he died because they were not able to resuscitate him. They were not able to put a breathing tube into his mouth because his lower jaw was broken. Where it was broken? It was broken during the interrogation because before he was sent into camp.
Yeah.
He was released and he was greatly honored person, and 1950s, 1960s in the USSR, again as a chief engineer who put first man in space and Sputnik and such. But they were not able to save him. Doctors were not able to save him when he had health issues because his face was disfigured because he was bitten so much in 1930s. So when we're talking about this period and we're talking about the accomplishments and achievements, all of that would have been accomplished, maybe not as quickly, but definitely with less human toll, and
suffering was too high.
Without human suffering. But again, it's not only human suffering. What actually have been accomplished?
Yeah.
What was it? It was a boogeyman, that scared the rest of the world, with only storefront of the human achievements. Because when you look behind that storefront, where people had to stay in line for hours to buy a pound of meat.
Yeah.
What this accomplished matter? What is a human value? I'm not talking about just simple humanism, which leads to, narcissism and hedonism.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about basic human needs that were not satisfied.
Of course. Yeah, basic necessities.
Basic necessities. So people were deprived in basic necessities. I remember I had a friend of mine from Sweden whom I took to my grandmother's village in central Russia. And not far from there was an air base. It was sophisticated jet fighters. And as we're walking on a dirt path, because there was no asphalt, there was no blacktop roads.
Yeah.
It was 1994.
Yeah.
He said, my head spins because here on the ground, you have 19th century, you have 1800s. And over there in the area, you have 21st century with all sophisticated equipment.
Yeah, it was a big disbalance.
It was huge disbalance.
Yes.
And it was unattainable because, yes, you could milk the people, you could milk the cow until it died, but when it drops dead, it drops dead.
True.
And now everybody tried to find this singular moment as to who's responsible, who betrayed, everything was going so well. What statistics would you take in comparison? But normal development and accelerated development of country and human prosperity under the late empire, pro-revolutionary empire. It was far from perfect, I'm far from idealizing it, but nevertheless, there was very rapid acceleration. Now you have access to all the data. Again, it's not perfect, but what came to change could be called positive only if you completely deprive the numbers on the paper from what the actualities on the ground were. And just
I would like to add, yes, I would like to add a couple of things. There are some Russian intellectuals like Alexander Dugin, who some circles in the West exaggerate as some kind of mastermind behind Putin, which is a nonsense. They give him too much credit, too much weight. And he thinks that propaganda war destroyed USSR. I completely disagree with his statement that Woodstock and rock and roll destroyed the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. I think they fell from within because of a great economic disbalance, social disbalance. Not that Jimi Hendrix was playing at Woodstock or Rolling Stones were releasing their albums, because how come that societies in the US and the UK didn't collapse. They were also exposed to that kind of subculture. So what do you think about? Yeah, please.
Yes, yes. I mean, to say that propaganda destroyed something. Well, what kind of personal convictions you had?
Yeah.
If somebody from abroad can so easily destroy you? What does education and analytics mean if somebody can convince you that your way of life is not true? You should be able, if you're so ideologically astute, you should be able to convince them otherwise.
Of course.
You know, it's from the gospel, you know, house that is divided within itself will fall. You know, a person, no matter how strong, if he comes from outside, could not so easily overwhelm a house which has order internally. Just recently in some Facebook post, there was a little quote from the journal of some high Soviet functionary from Moscow, who wrote it without anticipation of its ever being published, but now it have been, where he in complete horror observes the consequences of war in Afghanistan, precisely from socioeconomic factor, that people had no food to eat. People, the regions asking center, meaning Moscow, to introduce food coupons, so they would be guaranteed of buying whatever necessities. But he said Politburo could not introduce those coupons because A, it would deliver political blow, that what kind of economy it is that you need those food stamps. And another thing is that there is not enough food to correspond to those food stamps. So even if people would come, you know, to the store to get something with those food stamps, they still won't be able to buy it.
True.
The norm of why I mentioned that meat consumption, which just shocked me, in Rostov region in Russia, which is a very rich region, very fertile land. There is a good, healthy population. Everything. Rostov on Don, it's more or less southern region, you know, where you can grow pretty much anything. What was 1980, 1981, the norm was considered to be 2.1 kilos of meat per person per year.
Yeah, it's a disaster.
It's absolute disaster.
Absolutely.
So what kind of propaganda? Again, sharing from personal experience, but it was experience of millions of people.
True.
Where we'd go to visit relatives in a smaller town, we'd be passing through Moscow, but had to stay in lines for hours on to buy butter, to buy meat, to buy something, and we could not buy them ahead of time, naturally, because there was no refrigeration. We needed to buy it on spot, and in order to go and to deliver it to our relatives, because we know that they'll be feeding us and they'll have shortage of their own. I remember it in my memory, maybe 8, 10, 12 years old, where people would have to travel to bigger cities from the small provincial towns in order to buy it. You know, no, people were not dying of hunger, but again, to live only of you know, pasta and potatoes.
Yes.
You know, everybody had a little kitchen garden. Would say, well, it's good for your health. You know, it's good to work outside. It's builds your stamina. But in fact, after work, you had to go somewhere in the open field. I remember giving a piece of land in the former airfield in Riga, which was airfield since 1930. Do you know how much grass and roots there are? It was almost a meter of that vegetation that we had to remove. It pretty much left no dirt. You needed to brought it from somewhere else, and then to carry buckets of water to grow like tomatoes, cucumbers, if they would grow in such climate, potatoes, and says, oh, it's good. It's your own. It's what you call it. Without pesticides, it's natural, it's organic, and everything else.
It's a green vegetables and green.
It's green vegetable.
Green diet.
That's wonderful, but why my father, who was a doctor, and why my mother, who was a rehab specialist, you know, she worked with children who were handicapped and who had enormously physically challenging work, why she needed to go somewhere, spend an hour, maybe 2 hours to get there and still work in order to get something? Why she didn't get enough money, not having a villa, but having enough money to go and to buy it off the market?
Of course. Just regular stuff, nothing
Just regular food,
luxurious, of course.
nothing fancy.
Yeah.
You know, I remember, you know, my dad bringing me a banana or two just to try. You know, now bananas are, you know, who want a banana? You know, oh, you eat it.
Of course.
You know, don't be ridiculous. But somebody would bring you one. It's like, eat it before somebody would see it. Otherwise, they'll take it away from you. That was the level. I mean, yes, incredible achievement in space, incredible achievement in that, but at what human cost? At what human
I
cost? And
also remember in early 80s when I was 10, 11, to read in Yugoslav newspapers because I was interested in reading political headlines and political section of the newspaper that USSR is importing grain and wheat. And I wondered how come that a country with a fertile land, with huge territory, huge provinces known for food production, imports grain and wheat. In Tsarist Russia, the state was exporting wheat and grain, and now it turned
in
out
very
that
huge quantity, yes.
yeah. So
You know, for women to have winter boots made in Yugoslavia was almost a status.
yeah, it was a
You know,
status.
people would staying in line for. I'm not talking about model designer shoes from Italy.
Yeah,
I'm talking mass production Yugoslav shoes. And
exactly.
again, traveling through Balkans, I didn't realize that you have harsh winters.
Yeah,
So, but winter boots from Yugoslavia, it was status. People would show it off to each other and such. You know, it sounds funny, and probably people who would be listening to me would say, well, he's saying ridiculous things, or would say, well, it wasn't that bad. I'm
but
not
it's anti-Soviet propaganda. That would
anti-Soviet
yeah.
propaganda, but no, I'm just pointing snippets in life. Yes, most of the people lived okay, according to whatever standard is. The whole concept when people saying that somebody hates us, I mean us by whoever who lives better because of jealousy. We had no jealousy because we didn't know how could you live any other life. We didn't know any better.
Yeah, people
And
didn't
of
travel.
course,
Also. They were
yes, and of course,
forbidden to travel.
even living in the United States, I remember my childhood. But I need to say that I lived in a very privileged part of the USSR. I lived in Riga, in Latvia, and lived in the Baltic states, which was a western storefront of USSR. And there were things that I reminiscent about and feel very sad that my people could not have such luxuries in the United States. There were many different free of charge, obviously, clubs, intellectual ones. You could go and learn how to play chess. You can go and learn how to build plane models, history clubs, archaeology clubs, art and culture, singing, dancing, late Soviet Union. Yes, there were many different wonderful things. And some of them were pretty much stripped from ideology. You didn't need to learn necessarily, yeah, there would be bust of Lenin standing and red flag and all that, but you were not necessarily indoctrinated by participating in such activities. And there were plenty of things for instance, children to do. Medicine, if you were sick, the doctor would come on a house call. You know, even the lab person would come to draw your blood and collect urine tests and something like that. I don't know how it worked in the entirety of the Soviet Union. I'm hearing that even system supposed to work like that everywhere. It wasn't. And Riga was from a more privileged situation in that regard, where those programs were functioning well. And if you needed to see a doctor, yes, you may need to sit in line, and of course you may question as to the quality because of the lack of equipment, but nevertheless you can get access to a doctor. You know, even here in the United States, system is not that perfect, with an amazing technological advances in hospitals and everything else. In order to go and see a doctor, specialist, at times you need to wait for months. And if your child is sick, you still need to go and sit in an emergency room, you know, sometimes for hours on. what's better, what's worse. There is disbalance, finding some activity, especially in a smaller city, which I am presently living on, is a challenge. Sports section that you need to pay for, sports activities, but if it considers to be some intellectual life, I don't envision my children becoming great football players or soccer players or tennis players.
Yeah.
But I see the inclination to the more art and culture. I don't know where I can send them to, where they could be trained in, say, European art or whatever, private lessons. Again, it's not good or bad, but I remember how it was back when I was growing up, and unfortunately, I could not offer them the same things. So again, it seems like now I retract and justifying something. No, I'm just trying that reality was by far, by far more complex. What children being taught in school, how they being taught in school, how they taught math, how they taught literature, murder stories, seriously, horror stories. I kid you not. People don't know classics. People don't know Shakespeare. They may know by name, but they don't know European. Okay, classics from around the world.
So you're talking about the U.S. educational system.
I'm talking about U.S. education system, yes. And with as much of funds are allocated, why these are not taught? Do my daughter's classmates, for instance, know anything about Russian history? No, they don't. Or very vague idea. European history, for instance, history of the Middle East.
True.
I'm taking groups. We're in Israel and talking about various invasions, and a college-educated lady comes to me. She says, "This may be a ridiculous question. Please forgive me, but I genuinely do not know." I said, "What is that?" She said, "Who was first, Alexander of Macedon or the Arabs? Arab invasions, Islamic invasions."
Yeah.
Or Alexander of Macedon, who came first?
Yeah, they have these gaps in education.
Again, this is what considered to be basic. I didn't go to any, I had elevated level in history perhaps, but we were taught that in schools it was part of general curriculum. Whether you're going to use it or not use it is a different story. But we had to learn it. Had to be aware of it.
Yeah, probably in very elite schools they teach them the history of the Middle East or the culture of Eastern Europe, because I met a friend of mine and she's an art historian from New York City, and she thinks that the whole history of Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, Romania, ex-Yugoslavia, is a massive bloodshed where people didn't do anything else but killed each other. That's her concept, and that's her idea about the history of Eastern Europe. Like in Western Europe, they didn't invade, colonize, wage different state and religious wars. So I agree that some of them lack a classical education. It seems like a trend around the world to debilitate people with shorter and shorter curriculum. But what I wanted to highlight is how the Red Terror, what was the magnitude of the Red Terror, because we have contradicting figures. I remember Solzhenitsyn, when he was very popular in the West, he came with maybe inflated numbers of casualties of the Red Terror. What do you think, as someone who came from that?
Well, of course, I was fortunate enough not to live during this time.
Yeah, that's good.
And when Solzhenitsyn was writing his books, of course, he was an eyewitness himself, and he tried to do the research the best he can. But all the archives were closed. Not all of the archives are still are open even until the present day. And in fact, trend in modern Russia is again to close down the archives. They were open in 1990s, but now there is again this veil of secrecy that is overwhelming everything. And that's in that sense, for instance, Ukraine that opened all the archives. You know, I really praise their governmental officials who make that part of Soviet legacy more accessible. But the initial post-revolution horror in Russian Civil War, say 1917, 1922. There is no exact figures, but more or less what majority of historians agree is somewhere between 10 to 12 million, maybe as high as 15 million people, direct casualties. I mean, those who died on the battlefield, those who died of starvation, those who are more or less accounted for. Maybe there is some discrepancy of those who have immigrated.
Yeah.
But that's harder, and it's would be again as a small portion. We're talking about 1.5 million to 2 million, still huge numbers, but just a fraction of what the actual casualties were. And then, of course, there were.
You're talking about the period between the beginning of Soviet rule from
1917 and 1922, up prior to 1922.
Yeah.
Civil War. Of course, there were arrests, executions, prison camps, labor camps, and such. But machine was not as efficient and as dreadful as it would become in 1930s. When we're talking about great purges of 1937, 1938, which usually referred to, we're talking maybe about relatively small number of people who were executed. We're talking about 2 million people.
Yeah.
2 million people. But there were enormous number of people who have been arrested and sent to labor camps where they have died, you know, because of inhumane condition.
Of course, starvation
and starvation and inhumane labor conditions and such. But to rewind a little bit, we need to say that there were several famines under the Soviet rule. Most famous of them, of course, famine of early 1930s, where majority of casualties, but not all, but majority were in territory of modern-day Ukraine. But at the same time, famine was in delta and mainstream of Volga River, northern Kazakhstan and southern Urals. And during this famine, again, Soviet Union lost close to 10 million people. Again, historians debate, but between 7 and 10 million people who have died. Prior to that, there were famine again in Volga region in 1920s, 1922, 1924. Then there was another famine right at the end of World War II in 1946, 1947. And World War II itself, which because of gross mismanagement of human resources and important military commanding, led to the huge number of casualties. And who can blame Germans for doing that? But at least a half of the casualties out of which is figure 27 million officially recognized, but maybe more. So when we talk about between famines and starvations, another thing is there were several nations that have been arrested and replanted into very inhumane areas, you know, Crimean Tatars, you know, we're talking about Kalmyks, we're talking about
Chechens,
we're talking about Germans from Volga region. We're talking about those ethnic groups that have been arrested and deported into the areas where it was very difficult to survive, and of whom many have perished and nobody have counted. So we up from 1917 till 1953 or say 1960, we could perhaps safely talk at the just direct casualties of about 50 million people, Somebody counted, even as high as 100 million.
Mhm.
And I'd say that this figure is correct, but maybe not only as direct casualties, but as the outcome of the government policy. Those unborn, those who could not be born because of the social deprivation. Women prefer to have an abortion one after the other, just not to give birth because they have no place to live, as they could not provide for their children. Of course, of absence of contraception, of absence of family institution, just absolutely horrid situation. So that's the toll. That's the absolute enormity of it.
Of course, I mean,
What could possibly justify that? And again, somebody would probably be horrified and says how you could lump the casualties of World War II. But I could, because many of these casualties were avoidable, if not for the very controversial politicking by the Soviet government on the eve of World War II, and overall with the Soviet regime, where vast territories were lost, and Germans' policy of extermination of population, and at times where Soviets implemented the policy of scourge earth. When the Soviet army was retreating, the villages and towns were burned, but population were left to what? To mercy of Germans, the mercy of advancing German army. Without, we're not going to leave any infrastructure for Germans, no food, but what about local population?
They'll starve to death.
They'll starve to death. Of course, much after this collapse of the Soviet Union was done also by anti-Soviet propaganda internal to demonize Soviet authorities even more than it was necessary, and that's why we have some of the inflated numbers coming in. And you don't need to invent horror more than there were enough horrors happening. Blockade of St. Petersburg, just absolutely horrible thing where people were dying of starvation. Again, policy of centralization where Germans just destroyed food depots, and there was enough food to prevent the million casualties of starvation, but it was also indirect casualty of poor planning and being unprepared for World War II. And at the same time, Soviet officials had even their unique hospitals within the St. Petersburg, where they would have meat soup and meatloaves in time when people would eat a small tiny piece of bread of that size, half of it which was the wood chips, not even grain.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of heroic things. None of this is undermining the heroism of the Soviet people. The achievement of soldiers and officers and people who are working in the factories, again deprived of basic human necessities. But what needs to be done and needed to be done, but the environment in which that need would came very often from very unwise government policy internationally, but mainly domestically.
I mean, some officials think that the beginning of the Red Terror was initiated after the assassination of Moisei Uritsky in St. Petersburg, who was the local head of Cheka. But I tend to disagree with that, because they already had a program of the physical removal of aristocracy and clergy. So they didn't need the assassination of Cheka.
No, it was a pretext. It was absolutely a pretext.
It was a pretext.
And they would take, Lenin demanded taking hostages, and Lenin demanded execution of hostages. The famous story of how the city of Kazan, where Red Army could not take it, and they took hostages, the most, social, what's it called, socially alien elements, but they made the condition of their survival the surrender of the officers. And when officers surrounded, they executed the hostages still, and they executed the officers themselves who have surrendered. How the Civil War was won. One of the elements introduced by Comrade Trotsky was ancient, maybe it's legendary thing of, I want to say dissemination, the dissemination where every 10th would be executed. And there is going to be another group of soldiers who would go after the advancing lines, and in case soldiers would like to surrender to turn back, they would be executed by their own. Creation of concentration camps, all of that. Stalin was a monster, but he didn't come out of nowhere. He was part of it when it was implemented by Lenin, Trotsky, and others. So people say, well, don't touch Lenin because he's a holy figure. He's innocent, if not he's innocent, it's absolute nonsense. It's absolute nonsense because he demanded killing. So there are plenty of documents that he demanded. The bloodthirst was absolutely unbelievable. You wonder about humanity, but they didn't care. They didn't look. You see, the things that I try to relate is that you can justify almost anything if it's toward the benefit of man. But they were not thinking of benefit of man. It was just a slogan, because in real life, they didn't care even for those on whose behalf supposedly they were creating that revolution.
I mean, the way they waged the war against Germans and the way they sent troops poorly equipped or completely unequipped shows that they had a contempt towards their own population and their own party members.
Well, that for the first time, that very practice was implemented during the Civil War yet, where the last group of the whites that were on Crimean Peninsula were in good fortified locations, and the Red Army was sent wave after wave after wave after wave to overwhelm that. So whatever was happening during World War II was senseless frontal attacks, was enormous casualties, was absolutely enormous casualties that were not necessary, but were done exclusively, to make a gift to Comrade Stalin and to somebody else. That very policy was introduced even during the Civil War. It's not only inability, and again, sometimes, that could have been a positional war, where Germans could not advance anymore and Soviet army could not advance anymore. They could have waited. In 1943, situation still changed, where there was a buildup of military equipment. Lend-Lease started, so they could manufacture and use mainly American, but some English equipment and such. So the casualties of 1942 were largely in vain. People would disagree with it, saying, well, they were not defending anything. In 1943, they were able to accomplish much more with by far less casualties. So all of 41, and again, it also comes from the ideology. Soviet Union was trained, or Red Army was trained to attack, not to defend. Or Stalin's order signing that Soviet soldier could not be a prisoner.
True.
He could be only a traitor. And several million of Soviet soldiers who became prisoners at the first months of onset of World War II when it came to Soviet Union. We're not talking about partition of Poland or annexation of the territories. We're talking about when the war, actually, when Germany attacked Soviet Union. Where some soldiers didn't want to fight and some soldiers were just completely disorganized. Germans didn't know what to do with them, and they could not be treated according to the Geneva Convention because Soviet Union did not sign it. So my lamentation, for the lack of any other word, is precisely about the human toll, human life toll, what people who populated the territory of former Russian Empire and then Soviet Union had to pay for this very unwise and destructive policies of the government that it's implemented against its own population. Again, we could say that there were many brave ideas and good ideas, but ideas and reality on the ground are two big differences.
My question is, do you think that Putin's Russia is trying to mix pre-communist or pre-socialist values with positive, so-called positive experiences from USSR? So it's some kind of a hybrid ideology, if there's any ideology in modern day Russia. I'm talking about the state approach and state attitude towards Tsarist Russia and USSR. I had the feeling as an outsider that they tried to create some kind of a hybrid.
I'm thinking that it's a very controversial issue, let's put it this way. But I'd say that much, that in order to cover for unprecedented corruption and total and absolute disinterest in what's really happening in the country, the slogans are used of all sorts, an enormous amount of money invested into the storefront that is called to fool the outsiders and the population. Reality on the ground is, for most people, is worse than it was even in the late Soviet Union. Moscow and St. Petersburg and maybe some large metropolitan areas enjoy relative prosperity and quality of life. Yes, no doubt about it. You know, people actually amazed at how good Moscow and St. Petersburg looks and how convenient and comfortable it is. And even some Westerners moved in and just praising the enormous advancement that has been made. And that's true. However, not only we talk about wasted opportunities, but utter destruction of anything outside of major cities. If maybe more southern regions of Russia, where it's easier to conduct the business and land is more fertile, so there is agricultural things and associated something with agricultural. The rest of the country becomes more or less as the natural resource colony, you know. And I mentioned about this, that life in the small towns and small communities was closing schools, hospitals, and nothing coming in return. Okay, you didn't need 5 hospitals, you can one modern hospital, but in reality, out of 5 hospitals, you close 4 dilapidated one, or one just as dilapidated continue to function. It's just system of lies, and I lament it, because it didn't have to be in past 20-30 years, and current president had an enormous support in early 2000s, and oil prices were huge, so he had everything goes for him in order to bring Russia truly in 21st century, at least accomplish much more that have been done. And some things have been accomplished, yes, you have to give him credit, but then it just turned to mass robbery. That's the way I see it from my travels, from my experiences, from reading and such.
Of course,
so
I mean,
what we're talking about.
You're the citizen, and you have your relatives in Russia.
Yes. So when we're saying that, you know, insurrection of Russia, restoration of Christian values, and all that, storefront corresponding to it, but the reality is very far from truth. Reality is very far from truth, and how average person lives. I'm not talking about political situation, enjoying of them free courts and political opposition. I'm not going there. You know, there is plenty of that in the media that you could find and read and such. I'm talking about everyday things.
Yeah.
And that's not Western propaganda. You know, how person on the street lives, say in Kaluga or Ryazan or Ivanovo or Nizhny Tagil or Irkutsk, and I'm talking about fairly large cities. its life is far from perfect, and in many ways it did not improve.
Yeah, you're talking
In
about
comparison to
ordinary
the beginning.
citizens and how
Yes.
they, what's the perspective of ordinary citizens? We're not talking about
Yes.
high politics
Yes,
and geopolitical situation.
you could, yes, many people, not a lot. Majority of the Russians never traveled outside of Russia, but many did, like say to Turkey, to enjoy vacation by the warm sea, or they could have a computer, or they can have a car, maybe old one, used one, but it seems like an enormous progress. But in absolute terms, after 30 years, it looks like a mighty loss than an accomplishment. It looks like a mighty loss than an accomplishment, where professional people have to look very basic and employment that doesn't require any of the skills that they have been trained for, because they could not find a decent salary. And again, salary, exchange rate in comparison to euro and to dollar perpetually falls. So your ability of you buying for local currency goes down. What are the true salaries? What is the evaluation of true salaries? Say in the city of Pskov, it's what, 20,000 rubles, which is what, $300 less a month. In Moscow, it may be, again, who could make 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, many people more. But in Pskov, it's overnight train ride. It's not that far. 200 rubles, sometimes less. Rubles at dollars. Excuse me. What you can buy with it? What can you buy with it? So beautiful drone pictures of nights in Petersburg, all lit for New Year. I mean, it looks like a fairy tale. I saw, my heart sank. I almost had tears in my eyes. It's so amazingly beautiful. It's so amazingly inviting. COVID, non-COVID. I mean, wow, what a glory place. But when you're thinking outside the drone picture, outside the special effects, we're talking, about something that is, you have no roads, you have no access to medicine,
basic infrastructure,
no secure old age, you have no security for your children, for their education, for their well-being. And of course, perhaps people had to be more entrepreneurial, but coming out of the Soviet Union, who could be entrepreneurial? So it had to be a gradual process. But when the wealth is channeled into the hands of few men, there is a famous video clip by Robbie Williams, Party Like a Russian Oligarch, right? To build a space station. Was a loose change to build his own space station type of thing. Well, it sounds like a joke, but in many ways it's true. In many ways it's true. As I'm leading trips, many Americans who are coming to Russia, they looking at what Russia Today shows, and they coming all overwhelmed and mesmerized. And I don't know whether to support this propaganda and show them this Russian Orthodox Disneyland, which you could find if you'll try hard enough. Or to talk with them about the reality, because many people from normal environment could not believe the level of hypocrisy. They could not. They think that it could be this way or that way. The truth is always in the middle. But if you be talking the truth the way it is, the hard truth, it would completely dismantle the picture that they have in their head.
Yeah, they put lots of money in Russia Today and Sputnik. Sputnik and Russia Today are dedicated to this kind of propaganda and counter Western propaganda against Putin's Russia.
But leaving that aside, normal person wants just to live their life. Yesterday there was news. There was a wonderful magazine. It's called Our Heritage, Наше наследие, that was closed. It was a phenomenal publication. In absence of religious literature, when I was still a teenage boy, I was reading those magazines, and they were like a piece of art on its own. They talked about past, they talked about various things, mainly national heritage, cultural heritage, of all sorts. And I dreamt, I remember there was a huge article about Crisis Savior Cathedral, how wonderful it would be just to peek with one eye how it looked like. And well, now its cathedral is rebuilt. It's an exact copy, and you can go in and see for what it was. But this magazine created by people with very particular attitude to that heritage, with very particular love and passion, who wanted to preserve it. Now it has been closed. You can say financial difficulties, they could have restructured it, but I'm thinking it's very indicative as to what's happening in the country, where the lip service is done, where the storefront is complete, but anything in depth, there is no money, there is no interest, there is no promotion of it. There is propaganda of military might, of national pride, which I would say arrogance, but there is not much that is done on level where national monuments of enormous beauty are just decaying and falling apart, where the local museums don't have any attention, any money, there is no investment into things that are the most necessary. Like you write a lot about archaeology, archaeological expeditions in Russia. They are conducted, but it's certainly not the prime interest. It's certainly not the prime interest.
I think this is the problem with every nation that has a serious identity crisis, that they don't invest in cultural projects, they don't invest in science, they don't invest in arts. We all know that arts and science are superstructure. It has to be sponsored by the state or private entities. Many times it's not financially sustainable without donations, but on the long run, it gives positive results, and people can ripe the fruit of that investment, maybe not in 5 years or 2 years, but on the long run. And this is the indicator of wrong priorities of the state or political elite, not only in Russia. I can talk for hours about the situation in Serbia, which is a million times worse, where they also don't invest in science, arts. They never have money for these projects and experts. People who studied for years and they work and study all their life should be adequately paid. It's more important than paying professional athletes and some singers and entertainment individuals from show business, for instance. And it's very sad to hear that the situation improved minimally. Also, I wanted to ask you for the end, does Orthodox Church in America cooperate with the Serb Orthodox Church?
Yes. It's a very different question.
I'm moving completely to a different topic, but we're going to talk about that in the future.
Throwback. Yes, we have excellent cooperation with everybody. It's just a recognition or not recognition of a formal status. Slavic churches, for the most part, or non-Greek churches, let's put it this way, at greater ease with, and so is the Antiochian church. You asked about the
Patriarchate of Antioch. About the Middle Eastern.
The Orthodox Church, with the Orthodox Church in America. However, situation is such, as I explained to you last time, if it is recognition of formal autocephaly, you should not be able to open the parishes on the territory. And even if it was recognition of autocephaly, still America considered to be an uncharted land. So an even recognized local entity, we're still having our own bishops and establishing educational institutions, parishes, and everything else. That naturally doesn't call. It should, but there are no any protests because maintaining good relations is much more important. But we have this very, again, strange situation where Here locally, we are fully recognized, no problem. But for instance, if I, as a priest, would go to Jerusalem, I could receive communion, but I could not co-celebrate with local Greek clergy. Like in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, I could be in the altar, I could be with the rest of the priests, but I won't be vested, only for communion. Or if I'll go to Greece, the same thing. Well, there it would depends on the local bishop, but technically, no. In Constantinople, the same thing, although exception is made. And that shows the very abnormality, where, say, I was in Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and I could not serve. But at the same time, priest that belongs to the Jerusalem Patriarchate in the United States was substituting for me in my parish. So he was serving there, you know, and
so they have upper hand.
And serving my people. Yeah, but here I was, you know, I was allowed in, but I was not allowed in. Say, well, maybe one day it would work out. What's interesting, there is a close relation with Antiochian Patriarchate in the United States, and of course, this individual matter, Metropolitan Philip, who was the head of the Antiochian Archdiocese. For years, he was pushing the agenda of creating American autocephalous church. So he was propagator of that. And another thing is there are many converts in the Antiochian Archdiocese who are Americans, who are Anglos converted to Orthodox Christianity. And that naturally make them feel closer to the OCA, which also has great contingent of converts. So for that reason, there was always good cordial relations. I mean, it was everybody, but with Antiochians in particular, but also there is a ethnic blood factor, so to say, which is historical anti-ethnic. But it's emergence of this American Orthodox Christianity, which makes people bonding closer together.
Father Ilya, thank you so much. We can continue talking about Anglo-Saxon converts into Orthodoxy. This is an interesting topic, and I'm sure that many of them found their spiritual peace, and they found their religious worldview within the Orthodox Church in America or other Orthodox churches that operate on the US soil. Thank you so much, and bless New Year.
Thank you. You too. Till we see each other again.
Yeah, we'll see each other. God bless.